Hi, I'm James Brookes, and welcome to From the Factory Floor, a conversational podcast about all things startup and tech, brought to you by the folks at tsf.tech. So welcome to episode 6. I don't know how we've survived this long, but last week we spoke all about the startup sprint, and really it was me and Ian talking about the design sprint and then why we've adapted it into the startup sprint. And we mentioned that a big part of what we do isn't just the business side, but also the technical piece. Now, anyone who knows Ian and I, we aren't the most technical of human beings. So today, I'm very kindly joined by Aleksa and Eric, who are technical people who can tell us all about this week's topic, which is all about the tech and the architecture and how part of what we do in the startup sprint, but also going slightly further than that. So welcome, chaps. Aleksa, it's your
Hello.
time. Eric, is it your second one, Eric, or is it your third?
Second, yeah.
Oh, so you're both equal. Then that's fine. We're not.
Yeah. Hi, James. Yeah.
Well, so I think we'll just jump straight into it this week, really, rather than all the usual intros, because the football was awful at the weekend. I mean, I guess the main thing, especially, I've kind of absorbed a little bit of tech by osmosis rather than by learning. What's so important about tech architecture? Like, as in, what is it for sort of the non-technical humans out there in the world?
Well, I can start on this one. Well, I think software systems come in various guises. Really, there's a lot of different kinds of things you can build, and with development of different platforms and channels, there's always more and more moving parts in a software system, how it actually works and holds together. So for me, software architecture is that common understanding of the tech, of the entire tech product / system and its core components, useful for development teams to understand what is it that's being built and how the components interact, but also from a business investor and stakeholders perspective, understand what the system is and communicate that complexity and those moving parts in it. Not sure if you agree, Eric.
Yeah, and just like to kind of bring an analogy as well. So, software architecture is very similar to, building architecture in the respect that, when it's done well, people don't really notice it necessarily. And also something else, we seem to have, whether it's good fortune or not, we are recording this the week that, in the UK at least, the government, it became clear, had lost lots of records for COVID testing. And it turns out that they were using an Excel spreadsheet to try and store all the data, which is
Excel spreadsheet.
which is a brilliant example of when architecture done badly is terrible, because they really should have thought about that.
I guess that's one of the things, isn't it? Especially when it comes to sort of tech architecture, and obviously you guys really push that at TSF, is what sort of considerations do you make when you're looking at putting an architecture in place? Using that example where the Excel spreadsheet had a maximum file size, which is where it all went onto the track and trace system, then went sideways from that. What sort of considerations do you look at when you're actually thinking about a tech architecture?
I think important part of why we put architecture together, software architecture together in the first place is to give that guidance for technical standards to be used. And that covers both maybe lower level coding standards, but also all the, tools and platforms used, any limitations and handlings or any failures in between, really. So I think that might be a good link to that particular analogy. Understanding what components and what tools and platforms you use, whether they will fit for your functional requirements to do what's required, but also for non-functional perspective, does it scale enough? Does it have enough resiliency built in? Are you able to handle all the unexpected scenarios that will come along?
Yeah, you need to know like the pros and the cons, but the limits of whatever it is you're using. And to be honest, to make the decisions, you need to know the pros, the cons, and the limits of all of the things that you could possibly be using, so you know which one to pick. So yeah, you need a broad experience of different ways and different tools and so forth to get the right thing.
I think it's interesting. It's a world that's not alien to me, but it's still slightly foreign potentially. And a lot of the words and the buzzwords that get used these days, the scalability of the platform, because something we mentioned previous, Aleksa, in our chat about roadmaps, and Eric, when we spoke about MVPs previously, also we spoke about having a small chunk which enables you to achieve what you actually want to achieve. So how much do you have to plan in advance your tech architecture, while keeping in consideration, especially in our world of startups, the full blazing system, which is scalable, elastic, security up to whatever standard is needed, whatever ISOs. How do you balance the starting architecture versus the grand vision?
Yeah, that's a good question, and that's always apparent in sort of talking about agile and small iterative process of building a startup and then doing something upfront, which architecture does assume. I think from that perspective, I think one of the only facts I think that never changes is that there will be changes. So I think architecture is a collaborative process that evolve. But on the other hand, important to understand upfront high level of with the outside world, or some aspects that might be very important for a particular tech product in terms of security or resiliency, or these sort of failure scenarios that can be quite critical. I think there's been in the past, and I've been part of those conversations. Comments about architects' ivory towers, where the decisions about the architecture of the system would be made solely by architects without actually hands-on involvement from the development team and without much of a collaboration going forward, which I think gave software architecture a bit of a bad name. But I think what was missing there, just a bit of a balance, really, doing enough upfront to get that big picture so you can communicate it clearly why we're doing things that we are doing, but allowing for that collaborative piece that you can actually evolve it as you go along.
And then you just reminded me of whether you'd call it an architectural decision or not. You probably would. Somebody who we did some work with previously, who what I think what a lot of time people will do is they'll pick something that they know and they'll go with it. So and that's obviously a reasonably valid decision to make. You get the ball rolling nice and quickly. But I think they kind of either not thought about the future or not really appreciated the change, but they'd kind of picked an old technology and an old platform. The point was, instead of just picking up what you currently know, there is that thinking to the future and trying to anticipate stuff.
Yeah,
while not over designing it and overthinking it and trying to draw out your entire design up front in a waterfall fashion, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And I think from that sort of agile perspective, iterative perspective, what architecture should give you when you upfront is reasoning about the change, really. So if we were to go ahead and start building something, obviously there will be some new things that you maybe need to consider, but from the architecture you should know how that change should be planned for and then develop further. So I think there is that close relation in sort of being able to look forward, really, to change based on something you do upfront, a bit more upfront thinking.
So it's almost that think ahead, or just have that flexibility to, whether it's change or evolution, whether it's... So I know something we will discuss in a little bit is about APIs, which is something which I think everyone throws around these days. Everyone wants everything to be API driven all the time. I mean, do you guys have any thoughts on, especially when it comes to using potentially external services and APIs, how you integrate those, how they can potentially evolve in the future?
Yeah, so I mean, APIs have been really like a buzzword recently, haven't they? API stands for Application Programming Interface. It's in more generic form. It's any form of programming interface towards a different program, be it in the code But this more modern meaning is geared towards network communication, basically web APIs or REST APIs or however you want to call them. And there are some really good reasons why they have become popular on the sort of more of internal inner architecture level. They do allow for things like split stack development where your, say, front end and mobile apps talk to the back end of a defined contract that makes it easy to not only reason about, but also maybe potentially parallelize development and also have a different scalability requirements. But what's probably even more interesting in this sort of outer architecture, because what has become apparent in modern systems that they are not running on their own. So they are just part of the big world, and then you can actually collaborate on the software level with other services, and having a standardized ways to do this, which is well defined and understood, and can be easily, or not necessarily easily, but is clear how to proceed with APIs, have become really useful. I mean, I'll give you some examples, things like open banking, for example, where you have a standard of the APIs where you can actually now aggregate a number of services from completely different providers of banking services into a single platform, which I think gives a lot more value to the end consumer and potentially to startups who take that advantage.
And a lot more, close to home for a lot of people would be the examples of things like Slack integration and, where something in this system causes a message to appear in that system and might trigger something else, That's where we obviously see it a lot in the engineering community, integrations between GitHub and Slack and all those things. And they drive a lot of innovations themselves.
Yes. And on the other hand, what that allows as well is API to become basically a product. So you'll see a number of businesses out there, a lot of startups that don't have any flashy channels, mobile apps. All they have is the API. That is a product. So that just tells you how important that can be, that you can actually build a valuable business proposition really around APIs. Not to mention things like Internet of Things, which basically means talking to the machines automatically all the time, for which APIs are quite important as well.
So the only thing I think, the APIs internally, they make certain things easier and better to design. They allow us to collaborate with the whole world. It's almost as if they're brilliant golden goose eggs, or however that phrase goes now. But there is the one obvious kind of scary feature of APIs, which is the kind of dependence that they set up. So if I, for example, am starting a startup and we decide we're going to publish an API, as soon as people start using that, it becomes very hard for me to change, potentially. And similarly, as a startup, if I want to rely on a third-party systems API and then they change it, I need to be ready for that. So at the worst case, they might turn it off, but in the best case, they just change it for improvements and whatever, and we need to adapt and keep up with it.
Yeah, that's a great example how the something that sort of brings a lot of benefits brings other challenges that we might not have thought of, and they definitely relate to what we're talking about in architecture. Because if you do go down the API route, as Eric said, you now have to think about how to evolve changing, versioning, and backward compatibility, but also handling failure, because you can't allow your whole system to depend on a single API. And there are techniques and strategies how that can be made easier. But again, another thing you want to think about within the architecture. And then also scalability as well. Now that the whole world is linked in this sort of API grand scheme of things, if one of the components can't scale as quickly or as good as the others, there might be a potential for a bottleneck that you need to handle as well.
Yeah, and I think as soon as you publish the API as well, you open yourself up to potentially uncontrolled, levels of usage. It might be nefarious, it might be accidental, but it could just be because, someone else has done something brilliant and all of a sudden they're using you a lot and you weren't ready for it. So I guess the other thing that those APIs, kind of much simpler probably requirement they set on you, is to have a way of realizing when they change or when they get overloaded or something like that. So you have to build in, not necessarily into the architecture of your product, but into the architecture of your company, these kind of monitoring solutions and things like that.
Well, I guess, a lot of the things we've mentioned there are all to do with scalability. And I know, spoilers for next week, we're going to be talking about almost a cloud tech 101. But obviously, part of scalability is, and especially recently with the growth of AWS, Azure, Google Cloud Engine. I'll be able to talk at some point after 6 weeks of doing this, you'd have thought. But how... Obviously, when you start thinking about architectures, part of that is thinking about the sort of the cloud solution versus the old servers. And I think UK Fast had a big office in Manchester, and obviously going back to the TSF roots. How much of your architecture changes or has changed now in your guys' experience from what it was through to what it is now in terms of the utilization of the cloud and almost an expectation that everything is going to the cloud?
Yeah. I think, obviously we'll talk about it a bit more next week, but the cloud has become very ubiquitous, really. And the whole concept of how you get to the cloud used to be, I'm running on-prem or in a data center. Now I need to run onto the cloud. How do I transition into that? With modern startups that are building new tech products, they don't have that problem. So what they are thinking about how to get to the cloud straight away. And there's a term for that. It's called cloud native architectures. It is about designing your system cloud first without even thinking of anything how the software used to be run in the past, and embracing the challenges and the benefits really for running on the cloud. And I think one of the key things for that, for my perspective, is that ability to span the boundary between, developer machine, cloud, or anything else. Basically build your software, run it anywhere, which is what containers brought into the mix. So I think that for me is the key of the cloud native architectures, although it's not the only bit. The cloud native architectures do cover quite a broad range of anything that does relate to cloud deployment. Not having a physical service, and it means you need to consider automation from the get-go and that DevOps side of things, but also the managed services that the cloud offers. So you maybe don't need to run anymore any databases or anything like that. You'll just use it from the cloud that you have.
So that what we're saying there is that you can't rely on some architect who trained in the 70s or the 80s and has their way of doing things. In the whole world, things move on, right? But in the tech world, things seem to move on at a much higher rate. So architectures now will be entirely, completely different and almost unrecognizable from the ones even just 5 or 10 years ago. There's just so much to keep on top of and be aware of in the different ways that you can build and deploy, and it's not even limited to just how do I deploy my thing? Like we say, once you can deploy things in lots of places, you don't build it as one thing and then deploy it. You now build it as lots of things. And then similarly, in your kind of build stack, it's no longer just I'll build it here and ship it there. It's you've got things like you can pull them out of the running program and put them into the build program. So instead of having something in the database that you query all the time, you can just update a static website frequently from your build stack, if that makes sense. It's just completely different ways of thinking about things that have evolved and will continue to do so.
And obviously running in the cloud as well will obviously have other sort of consideration, which will be much more closely paid attention to, things like security and segregation of services, and something you, James, mentioned a few times, and I think we did scalability in general. How do you everything you build should be built with that in mind. How would it run in a cloud where you can run in 10 different servers and 10 different data centers, maybe even across the regions, and how would that impact your platform as a whole?
Yeah, because I think part of that isn't just the scalability, it's the robustness of that. Is, like you just said there, Aleksa, it is that, running across multiple data centers gives you that, should one data center go down, you have that ability to recover, and that recovery aspect, because obviously most startups are aiming for almost this hockey stick style, and obviously there's multitudes online around how growth, and you see these unicorns and all the buzzwords that people like to throw about that we usually dislike, but I seem to throw about anyway on this. But being able to scale potentially very quickly, I mean, I think previously, showing my limited technical knowledge here, it was a very vertical process. And then it was moving to more, especially the cloud, enabled more horizontal scaling.
Can I turn the table a little bit and actually pose a question instead of answering one?
I suppose, as long as it's not aimed at me.
Why not? Why not, James? We've kind of talked, about lots of pros, but is there anything that's scary? Anything that we're worried about in, these kind of native architectures, cloud native architectures?
I mean, I think from a business perspective, because I will actually answer your question, Eric, I feel comfortable with that. Thank you for that, just chucking it up in the air for me to knock out the park. I think the biggest worry is almost the expectation that cloud fixes everything. I think, being a buzzword, and I have seen it where some of the architectures, not necessarily that we've done, but that we've been involved with, haven't had that scalability, which is almost the expectation that being on the cloud brings. I think there's also a cost expectation as well. So a lot of sort of the negatives that I've always seen is this managing the expectation of what cloud does versus what cloud actually gives you. There's also an element of the tooling as well. I think and the skills needed. Kind of the main, and obviously this is without trying to go too much into spoiling next week's episode when we eventually get around to recording that. But I think the expectation management of what cloud gives versus what cloud does is potentially one of the risks around it. And Aleksa, obviously, you assume you've got more of a technical input than mine.
Yeah. I think all of this just says, that this opportunity for startups and new tech products to go to cloud directly and think about cloud native from the get-go just gives, again, a bit more importance that needs to be thought of upfront a bit and as part of your general architecture plan, really, where things are and how which services are there. Because now when you're in the cloud, there are much more moving parts than there used to be. So where are they? Identify the risk, identify with them, and how you manage that risk, really, so you don't end up in a situation where your Excel spreadsheet fails in the middle of it.
I do enjoy that they hadn't thought about the maximum file size issue. But I mean, Eric, do you have a thought on what do you see as the risks around cloud and how it's grown?
I guess the only one that's kind of massively worried me when I've set up a project is kind of runaway cost things. So if you make something infinitely scalable and then you accidentally infinitely scale it and you pay for the usage, then there's a potential infinite cost there, isn't there? Which, as long as it scales with actual income, is fine. But if it scales because of a mistake, then that's not very good, is it? So that's been a personal worry. I forgot the other thing I was about to say. Classic.
If anyone's any proof that this isn't scripted,
I'm not made for podcasts, am I?
I think you do a very good job. A better one than I do, and I've done 6 of them so far. So, but I think, like I say, I think my perspective, I think some of that we've echoed here is it's the managing the expectation of cloud and also managing some of the risks. Like you say, I know one of the things we've dealt with in past lives is the elasticity of systems and making sure that they can scale. But then if there is a huge spike in demand, that it then scales back down as well to manage the cost. Yeah,
I've kind of realised again what it was I was going to say. It was about the expertise. So, back in the day, every company needed to have, a database expert and an infrastructure expert and stuff like that. So are we now in a position where everyone needs a cloud expert, or can you actually run a company without a cloud expert?
Well, I think we've seen, especially over the last couple of years, the growth of DevOps, which is development and operations, which really used to have the infrastructure guy, so to speak, who lived in the basement with all the servers and the tin racks everywhere.
I've just got Noel Fielding in my head now.
Yeah, I think you've too much IT crowd for everyone, that or watching the Bake Off, although Matt Lucas is probably more like, I would imagine, the infrastructure guy to look like. I'm going completely off track here. I do love the Bake Off. I mean, if Paul Hollywood was in the basement, I'd be terrified of going down there ever again. But no, I think the growth of DevOps is as a role, whether that's having another person in there or actually just replacing that person.
I'm wondering whether that will be, as if everything as a service in a sort of a cloud infrastructure platform space. Maybe that sort of support will become more of an as a service, so you can have a team that manages cloud for many startups, for example. Because I think you're right, Eric, that does add additional, if it is required, additional, obviously, cost and for managing this expertise, really.
Yeah, I obviously think that, you don't really need it. You don't need cloud experts. A lot of startups will start quite simple. So it's one thing we've not covered in the architecture talk so far is actually just keeping it simple. Back to the building architects. You're not a good architect just because you've built on extra stuff to a building, right? It's about, designing it right and making it work, but also doing it simply and robustly and stuff like that. So, actually a lot of startup, although we talk about a lot of complexity, a lot of startups architecture will be quite simple and very similar to another startup's architecture.
That was one of I think the point I was just going to go to, because I know just looking at the time here, was going to be what would be your either main piece of advice or the main takeaway you'd want people to have when it comes to architecture as a whole, and would yours be that almost to keep it simple, sort of the whole KISS method of making sure things are as simple as possible but allowing it to scale?
I wouldn't probably put keeping it simple as my top priority, because I think people might think that keeping it simple means sticking it in one box and not worrying about it. I think the flexibility part is, separating things out and making it so you can build different parts in independence, and deploy them independently and run them independently, and, segregating off failures in the independent parts, etc. That's the most important part of all it, and the cloud just makes that easy.
Aleksa, I would echo that. So flexibility, extensibility, if you can think about that up front and make it relatively straightforward when it comes to that, and it will, because the change is constant. That's definitely most important. I would maybe just add on that sort of a communicative aspect, making sure that the architecture does demonstrate what it is. So not only your technical team, but also your stakeholders, maybe even on the board level, understand what is it that you are building. If it is a tech product, it is a key part of the business. So the understanding needs to go wide.
No, I think the best architectures that I've seen, the best architects, have been able to show the tech architecture in a way that a business person, although they might not understand, a pure business person in this regard, might not understand quite how the system works, but has a good level of understand that this is what this does this, and this is how the communication flows, not necessarily how it works.
That's just remind me of something which, I kind of use as an internal kind of measure, but I very frequently am drawing diagrams with boxes and arrows, and making the diagram look pretty or simple isn't just a benefit for the diagram, because if to draw my system I've got lots of squiggly lines crossing each other and everywhere, it means my system is a mess and it's nasty. If I can draw it, on a 2D piece of paper and just look at it and get it, then it's well architected. It's neat and simple. So it's a good measure. You need to be able to draw your thing without it looking like chaos.
I think that's probably the best bit of advice. As long as you can draw it on a piece of paper, and people can look at it and kind of understand what's going on, and it's at least a good start. Well, I think that probably wraps it up for today. We're just sort of getting up to the half an hour mark. So I'd like to thank you both for your time. And as I think we've alluded to already, next week's all about Cloud Tech 101, effectively. So I think you two are both joining me again next week, aren't you? So you don't get to escape now. That's it. Well, no, thank you very much, guys.
Thank you very much. It's good.
It's a pleasure. Bye.
See you soon.
See you soon. I think that just about wraps things up here. If you have any thoughts or questions on anything we've said today, get in touch, whether that be through our Twitter @RealTSF or email at hello@startupfactory.tech, or feel free to drop in for a coffee and a chat. As ever, thanks for listening.